And now I'm going to just share a little bit about our guests of honor before they take it away. We have this evening Helen O'Hare as our moderator, and she joined Mulholland Books in February of 2020. She is hungry to find suspense of all kinds, as well as commercial and women's fiction for Little Brown. She loves literary page turners with a rich sense of place, character-driven suspense, and narratives that open up an unexpected perspective or closed-off communities. She previously spent 6 years at G.P. Putnam Sons, an imprint of Penguin Random House. Helen got her start in the industry with positions at Other Press and Viking Penguin after years of indie book selling at the Boulder Bookstore and the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Colorado. And as for our author, today we have Paula Lichtarowicz. And Paula studied English literature at Durham University and has a master's in psychology from the University of East London. She's the author of 2 previous novels and worked as a television producer in London for 20 years. She currently lives in York with her daughter and dog. And as I was preparing for tonight, I also read that Paula was raised in the UK under the influence of eccentric Polish relatives, and that Paula has a desire to write as honestly as possible stories that address the confusing business of navigating life and human relationship. In her latest book, The Snow Hare, you will see that Paula explores motherhood, love, and how much we need other people. I came across this review quote by Frances Liardet, the New York Times bestselling author of We Must Be Brave. And she said, Lichtarowicz is a writer of great talent with the ability to portray hardship and grief shot through with humor and hope. The gorgeous prose, compelling storyline, and emotional depth ensure that The Snow Hare remains in the reader's mind long after the last page. So remember, we will have time for Q&A. RJ Julia Wesley and RJ Julia and Bookhampton are so grateful to have Paula Lichtarowicz and Helen O'Hare here in conversation today. I'm going to let them get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. It is such a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be here with Paula. Paula, thank you for joining us tonight and congratulations on your pub day for The Snow Hare.
Thank you. It's very exciting. It's very exciting that it's happening over there. It's not happened over here yet, but it's a nice little start to it all. So yes, very happy.
And I think it's I'm a little jealous of authors in the UK because I don't know if people in this room know, but US books are published on Tuesdays and generally UK books are published on Thursdays. So when authors have a book out at the same time in both countries, you get to sort of celebrate all week long, which is, you know, seems like to me, if you've written a book for many, many years, and we'll get into your writing here, but you know, a week-long celebration or more seems deserved.
I think so. I agree with that. We're starting now. We'll start tonight. So yes.
And thank you for joining us. I know it's late there as well. So we are just, you know, glad that you're here. So I want to say a bit, obviously, that was a wonderful introduction. I'm an editor at Little Brown and Company. And, you know, it is my job and also just my dream to look for novels that speak to me in a way that speak to me the first time I read them and don't stop speaking to me. I'll say it that way. I receive many, many books a year from literary agents, from other connections in the industry, thinking about what are the books we should publish. And when The Snow Hare came to me, it actually came through a colleague who is now Paula's editor in the UK, who's fabulous. But she sent this book to me and she said, you have to read this. You have to read this and you have to know this woman. And I thought, you know, okay, everybody says that in their email to me. I mean, that's not the first time someone has said that to me about a book. But then I opened the Word doc at the time of The Snow Hare and I just couldn't stop reading. I had to read it. I was so moved and so struck. I mean, primarily on two fronts, first of all, and I think in all the times I've read the book since, I've been struck by all sorts of other things as well. But it was your beautiful writing, Paula, which I think, you know, Frances Liardet really called out just line by line how transporting I found this novel and how honest the book felt about, you know, emotion and difficult circumstances, and also, you know, joy and love and positive emotions. Everything was there. And then I was also so struck by Lena, your narrator. Her voice and character were just unlike anybody I'd quite met. I have to admit, at first I was like, oh, I don't know if I would have been friends with her as a young woman. I mean, who is this person? But also her big dreams about being a scientist, I was really so curious about her. And then as I followed her through, the course of her story and her life, I felt like she opened my eyes to so many things. So I loved your book. And of course, from that love, I was lucky enough to speak to you, see how wonderful you were. And we were lucky enough to be able to publish the Snow Hare. So that is my big love fest for you. I would love to now let people hear more from you. So Paula, I know it's pub day, so maybe some people have read it, maybe people have not read yet. Would you just tell us a bit about the book as you think of it?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Helen. And, likewise, this book has been drafted by me, but certainly you've been instrumental in helping it get to its finished form. So I really appreciate that. I think of it as a whole life story, actually. I think there's a lot of emphasis put on this as being a story about war in Siberia, but it was very important to me that this is a story of a woman, and it's a story of a person and how we change and the things that influence us throughout our life. So it's about a girl growing up, wanting things, being ambitious, and how life forces you to accept different circumstances, the choices that you want to make, you can't take, how you cope with that, really. And I think as a writer, I always feel for artists, actually, when I see people trying to paint trees and stuff, because you think you're never going to get it. You're never going to get the tree as beautiful as it is in real life. And the same thing happens when you're trying to write. We change, we grow, we develop. And I developed as I wrote this. And it's part of that, trying to encapsulate what happens to a person through a life, what they live with and what they learn to deal with. And along with all that, it's about how you cope with war and how you find hope in dark places and how you cope when you have no power. I'm in a position where I control a lot of my life, and that wasn't the situation for my grandmother, on whom this book is based. So it's about a girl who wants things, ends up in a conflict and in a marriage that is not of her making and of her desires, and how she comes to sort of manage her life, really, and deal with the situation she's got.
I could read this book again and again, and I could listen to you talk about this book. Tell us a bit about the inspiration, sort of where the idea for the story came from, and then from there, maybe a bit about, the writing process.
It came from an interview I did with my grandmother. So I grew up with a Polish grandmother. My grandparents had come to Britain after the war. My father had been born in Palestine and had come over and grown up here. And I had one of those childhoods, I was sort of considered quite Polish by my friends at school because I had the Polish surname. But I obviously was very British, and I went to a Polish school on a Saturday, but I was in the class of people who didn't really speak Polish because it was my father who hadn't spoken as Polish as him. So it was this sort of, and we had all the Polish rituals that Christmas and Easter. So it was very much a part of our life. But I had this grandmother who didn't speak about what had happened to her. And we knew there was a terribly sad story that she brought with her. We knew her circumstances were dreadful, that she'd had to leave her home and had gone to a Siberian work camp. But we never really talked about it growing up, and she never talked about it. And I think that's a fairly common thing. So as much as it's an extraordinary story, to me, it's, I think it's fairly common to many of the people who've gone through it, that it's something that they hide away. And then when she was older, and I was all grown up and I was working in television, making documentaries and listening to people's stories all the time, I was like, well, she's getting on. We need a record. These things matter, and actually what she went through really matters, and she's never really spoken about it. So I had to persuade her to sit down, which took some doing. And then we recorded it on one of those little old dictaphone tapes, which was really clunky and old. And that done, I just put it away, thinking, right, that's covered. It was before I started writing, actually. And then I came back to it, having written my first book, and I was just curious about, I just wanted to hear her voice again. So I found the tapes and I listened to her voice, and I was sort of blown away by the story, really rediscovering it. And it sort of started from there, really.
It's incredible. I think, I don't know that much about my grandparents' stories. I wish I had asked. And I think it's amazing that you did and you recorded this. And I'll say, you've been so gracious to share just a few clips of those interviews. And they're just incredible to hear her voice and to hear the two of you talking.
But you know what? It's the bits around the edges of that I love, because I was looking over the transcripts I did, and it's the bit where she's trying to make me eat more pizza or go and feed the blackbird or go, it's all those interactions that I'm are very precious, and I'm very glad that I've got them. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? There's a real narcissism to being a child. But it's certainly, I think in relation to my parents, how much do you know of really the motivations of your parents for what they did in their lives? And everyone's life is extraordinary, at least to them and their nearest and dearest. So it's, yeah.
What struck you? Was there anything that really surprised you sort of that first time you sat down with her? And then I'd love for you to talk about what it was like coming back to those tapes later.
Sitting down with her, she was very evasive. She didn't want to do it, and I think it was a hard ask. We did it over 2 days, and so the first day we did a lot about her youth and sort of run up to the war, and then the second day she came back and she said, I haven't slept all night thinking about what I have to talk to you about. And then after that she said to me, I haven't told you everything. I couldn't tell you everything because it would just be too much. And I thought it was the real realization actually of what she was carrying, and seeing it from her perspective, not, me as a child looking at an elderly woman who fed me cake. It was seeing it as a woman who had suffered incredible things. And then thinking that there were so many others as well. It was, it was millions.
Yeah.
So
It's incredible. So when you went back and listened to the tapes, what was going on in your life then? Were you thinking about writing this book? Was that a sort of separate decision? What was it, like to open that box and listen to them again?
No, I was just casting around for something to do, and I was pregnant at the time, and I think that was an influence because I was just restless about what was going on in my life, and I also knew, again in the tapes, my grandmother is going on at me to, when am I going to have children? That kind of conversation that you have, when's it going to happen? And I must have been in my late 20s then, and it just wasn't in my head at all. And and what's going on with your boyfriend, and when's it going to happen, and that kind of thing. So like a couple of boyfriends down the line. I'm just drawn to think of her again. Mm-hmm. And I also don't know what I want to write next. And because I'd written, the books I'd written were very much skewed towards sort of more magic realism, fairy tale, more about sort of storytelling, the potential that you can take with a story and create other worlds. I like the freedom to explore. I like, you have great liberty in constructing worlds. I just didn't know where I was going. And I thought, well, in the meantime, I've listened to these tapes, I've connected with Barbara again, and this story is just extraordinary. And I have no experience in historical fiction or biography, but I just thought, I'll do what I do at work, which is transcribe it and get closer to it by just getting close to the words. And I just thought, actually, I just feel I need to try and tell this story, tell your life story, so the record is there of what you've gone through, and that's where it started. And obviously I failed at telling biography, just couldn't make that work. So
lucky for us, I'll say. I would love the biography too, but I think this novel, it tells her story, or a story inspired by her story, but it does so much more as well. So would you talk a bit about how your grandmother's story became Lena, then the character here, and how much of the book is fact and how much of the book is fiction?
Yeah, so I did literally start trying to tell her life. And it's interesting now because I was thinking about the bits that I've missed out from her tale. And there were some great stories of daring do at the start of the war, when my grandfather, so he'd been in the Polish army, and obviously within a couple of weeks, all the officers were told to go and disband and just get out of the country, basically. So he tries to get to Sweden, going to the north, and my grandmother picks up her daughter and goes after him, and has this encounter with a Russian soldier who lets her through the border when she shouldn't, and then those borders are closed and she comes back, and then they try to get over the mountains to Hungary. And there's all these stories of her going off in a sleigh with him and someone whispering which sleigh to take so that they haven't got suspicions. And he ends up being captured with this because his ski breaks. So there's all this stuff. And I think this is what I was trying to write, because it did, you know, it still seems extraordinary to me that these things went on. She was what, 18, 20? And she was doing all this kind of thing. And then later on.
I truly can't imagine, like, incredible.
No. And with this child in tow, she had, you know, this 2-year-old under her arm, whatever. So there was all that stuff. So I think that's why I thought, wow, I just need to try and tell it. And I'm just probably not a biographer, because it doesn't work for me when I'm trying to tell someone's real life. I needed to step away. So what I decided on was that I had the structure of her life, which was, I sort of think almost like as a washing line I could pin points to, hang things off. And I knew what had happened, and there were names for people I kept, but I didn't know the characters of her parents or her siblings or situations like that. So that allowed me room to start creating. And actually I found when I could let her go and let someone else in, it would give me a bit more freedom and control. And it also reinforced what felt really important, which is that what I was struggling with was what she was struggling with, which is that war deprives you of control. So you have no freedom to move, and I didn't have freedom to move in that. And then that became a situation that the character Lena had to deal with. She has to try and find a way to take choices, make decisions, which is all she wants to do in life. And that's what is sort of denied you. So it was finding a way to have a narrative that worked on many different levels for the character, for the general plot. Yeah, it was anyway, got there in the end.
Yeah, I mean, and so well. I think, Lena, it's so interesting to think about this as a book about choice, you know, when we have the ability to make choices, when we don't, because Lena is so sure of herself as a young woman. I think I was so struck by her, but also maybe, like, you know, I was not that sure of what I wanted in life when I was that young. And so you've created a character that really does sort of dream and know what she wants, and to see that come up against, you know, the wheels of war and global politics and all of these things that are so completely out of her control, and felt a bit, I think, before now as an American, like sort of abstract or like of the past. And of course, the novel coming out now, these things don't feel quite so distant, you know, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all of the sort of this modern moment with Russia, which, how has it felt publishing this book? You know, you wrote it, I feel like, in a different world in some ways, but maybe you don't feel that the way that I do.
I feel a sort of a yin and a yang about this, right? I feel on the one hand, it reminds you why historical fiction is important, that you have these warnings from the past. This is coming round again, these kind of invasions. I mean, Poland has always been precarious, right? In the 19th century, it didn't exist as an independent state. It had been swallowed up by Germany, Russia, and Austria. And so it had 20 years, basically, of the Second Republic in between the First World War and the Second World War, you know, and then it was swallowed up by the Soviet Union again. And I think it's only just coming out of that. So all that feels like, you feel like, yes, fiction reminds you that we can have periods of peace, but then there is, you know, it's precarious, it's not safe. On the other hand, I do also feel that I reflect back on what happened to people like my grandmother, and I think, you know, I don't know, I'm born. I'm lucky enough to live in a place and a time of fairly sustained peace, comfort. I don't worry about nuclear attacks and getting under the table. You know, maybe I should, but I think so you balance this idea of peace as a construct, and yet this hope that we're living in a safer world. But, you know, like you say, with Russia, it's fragile, very fragile.
Yeah. And I think you capture that fragility so beautifully in the novel too. And the hope that comes, you know, fragility, but also the hope for the peace. I think that comes across very beautifully as well. How long did it take you to write the novel? Getting back, I think a little bit more on the craft. I'm not even remembering how many years you actually sort of from opening the box of tapes, coming to this idea, and then the book we hold now.
Do you know, it's really weird to be sitting here with talking to you when I remember that it was a hard time, actually. So I had 2 books out, and, you know, both of them had sort of come and gone, and just, it's almost like the reverse of some magician's trick where they create things out of nothing. You sort of throw something in the air and it just disappears. And you think, well, you know, is it worth it financially? Is it worth it in terms of time it takes? But it was what I wanted to do. So I just kept going, and had a small child, so I really wasn't sure whether it was getting everywhere. And I think I remember sending it off to my agent just before Christmas, which is probably the worst time for an agent to get a manuscript, saying, I loathe this and this loathes me now. Please take it away. And after about, that was probably 4 or 5 years of going on, because, you know, you do a draft, and it's that said about sort of fail again, try again, fail better. You do a draft and you think it's not quite there, it's not quite yet. And and there's a point where it comes to life, and that's really exciting. And you think, yes, that works. But for me, it takes a long time, you know.
Yeah. Well, and especially I think bringing to life a fictional story from real roots, I think that is such a process, because you have to disengage from the reality and the impulse to stick to what is real or true or known, and sort of create the emotion of a novel or fiction. And I think I've worked with many authors sort of trying this kind of project, and I think it's challenging, and it takes time. 4 to 5 years doesn't seem so crazy to me at all.
Okay, but the point is, it's not crazy now. I look back and you've got a book there, but I think at the time you think, well, what if this goes nowhere? What if this is just in my head? That's the thing. So, you know, the moment you step on board, I'm just like, hallelujah, the ship is saved, you know. All right.
It is true. It's like, I like to think that I can understand what it's like to be writing the novel before, but I can't. I'm sitting here just, you know, when I see a novel come in from, you know, a literary agent, I can really think about, how will this book be in the world? And I know that it is not always like that for authors, especially as the story is taking shape. I think editing your book was just such a special experience, in part because you're just, and you're so fabulous to work with. Everything, I feel like you would provide insight in every email, which is not something I can always say. But I don't think anybody would say that about all of my emails. So it's just a pleasure. But I also often, I work with authors in different ways, and to different levels of involvement on the page itself, you know, from the larger questions to really digging in on the line level. And I feel like in your book, you know, for us, and we were editing as well with your UK editor, who's so brilliant and who had worked with you before. I was sort of the new member of the team, but it really, to me, was just so much of the manuscript was so alive. It was thinking about, like, where can I give you my reaction as a reader? And to me, it was just pure pleasure to sort of read and respond and tell you how this world and this woman were striking me. But I'm curious for you to talk about. I actually haven't asked you this either, what it was like to be edited with this book. It's such a personal story. It's one that is so far-ranging. I mean, how did it feel to be writing a novel like this and then to go through an editorial process?
I'm trying to think which way I approach this. So my background in television means that I understand that there's elements when you make a documentary, right? You have, you know, that's a way of ownership, and you feel like you possess this thing, and then somebody comes in with a reader. So, you know, you have to be open to perspective and criticism, but it's still hard. But when you came in with your points were so valid. So anybody listening, Helen's fantastic editor. totally shored up. You made sense of the whole issues of motherhood and Lena's character. You got us going a lot quicker. There was the gnarly business of marrying Anton. I remember you just clarifying all that. So it's brilliant. And I felt really relieved because actually, you know, when you're sitting with this thing on your own for so long and it's opened up to people who are so supportive and so passionate, then you can put your trust in that person and that process. And it's been wonderful working on it together, and you've made it so much better, you know, and that's just, for me, I have so much great gratitude, and I'm so grateful for that. It really, I think particularly the mother, the elements of her relationship with her mother and her relationship with Anton, actually, which are tricky. Really, you could pinpoint them. So I think brilliant at what you do, Helen.
Well, that is very kind. You know, your check will be in the mail, right? But it's such a gift to have a book where there's such a wealth of story and emotion. And I mean, you really do sort of tackle the range of relationships. I mean, what is a relationship that's not sort of explored to some extent in this book? And so I think just having the chance to talk with you about what was really, you know, important to you or what you really wanted to convey, I think that was a really, you know, to me, exciting way to think about this book and think about what this book could be, with all the cooks in the kitchen, which is part of the editorial process. Is there anything that didn't make it into the final book that you miss, or any sort of favorite moments that were changed that you start? I mean, I don't want to like sort of reflect on what's not in the book, but are there things that didn't make it into the story that you think are worth hearing about still? Obviously the sleigh ride, the broken ski, I mean, all of that from the original story of her grandmother, but.
Yeah, no, the only thing, this is just my slight dog obsession. The only thing I hold on to is I had a scene where the dog comes after the cart on the way to the railway station, and it just, I know it killed me, and actually it probably killed me too. I had to take it out because it was just awful. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear the dog and that moment. So the dog stays under the bed.
Thank you, I guess. I'm like, I can't even imagine it. Oh my gosh.
No, so I think that was, you know.
Well, this is another burning question, though. I think we had talked about this once before, but the dog in the novel, also, again, a very important relationship that you delve into. The light that dogs bring to us. Is the dog in the book based on a real dog? Tell us about writing a dog.
No, I've always had dogs and grown up with dogs, and
did you always know there would be a dog in this novel?
Yeah, I think dogs, animals are important in books as they are in life. I think they give you, they're in like, you know, I grew up in a big family with lots of dogs and things, and they were this lightning rod, you know, when everyone's arguing or whatever, the dog absorbs some of that or changes the dynamics. And I think they operate very well, especially with sort of slightly tricky characters like Lena, who's, you know, struggles sometimes with the world. She can confide in the dog, and I think certainly I relate to that. I relate to the peace you get from them, and they're a different sort of psychology and understanding, a different way of showing empathy, you know, showing how humans can be their best selves, really. So yes, always have dogs. Although Frida, who I've said is behind me on the sofa, strict behavioural warning.
Which is too bad because she's beautiful. I wish she would surface. So I know that's for you to deal with. Also, I'm like, I want to, you know, I've been pushing my husband to get a dog. So I'm like, again, I will make him watch this video and hear you speak about having a dog in your life. I also love Pavlov is the name of the dog, right? I don't want to misspeak here, but I think he is also such an advocate for Lena's scientific research in the early chapters, which I really enjoyed having him there.
Yes.
Now I'm just.
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm just thinking what else you brought in this, you know, this more historical perspective of women and science and the changes through the century, which I'd not noticed so much. I'd felt it with her personally, and it was very much through the characters, but you were able to stand back and take that perspective, and I think that was really useful.
Happy to hear that. Did you do a lot of research about the sort of, you know, the medicine and the, you know, science and there's this whole thread throughout the book of Lena wanting to be a doctor for those that have not read. And so did you do a lot of research on what that would have been like for women at the time? And then I think beyond that, if you could tell us a bit about just the research you did writing the book beyond your grandmother's story.
Yes, I obviously found out that it was accurate to say that, women weren't yet doctors there, and people were starting to be admitted, and that the antibiotics were the correct antibiotics, and those kind of discoveries. And also Pavlov and the behaviorism and those kind of things I know were sort of just burgeoning, and women pilots. And it was, that context was interesting actually about what would and wouldn't be possible. And the wider research, I suppose, so my attitude was this: I needed to get the story right. I needed to get the characters right. I knew what had happened to my grandmother, although she was very vague on dates and places. So I sort of focused on that. And then in between drafts, where you sort of I have to leave it so I lose a connection with it and can come back to it fresh, I would do some research and read up. And I read a very good thick volume about Poland in the Second World War, and then I found some stories, actually some archive material about children's experiences of exile, these really hard-hitting accounts. And then on the other side, I looked into some literature, some people who'd written about that. It was actually more specifically about the Gulag, and so they were a bit more focused on prison camps, but it was just to get that idea of what it was like in Siberia and what it's like to be worked that hard and to be that hungry. So then I could make sure that I was aware of the wider forces and the wider history. But again, it doesn't, I don't, it's funny because it is historical fiction, but I don't see it that way, because it feels, I wanted it to be quite impressionistic. I wanted it to be about a woman and her life, and the war is there and happening, but actually it's not about what make of guns were used and what happened when at what particular point. Because also I think the human experience of war, particularly at that time, without dates, without awareness of newspapers, and the radio was cut off, you don't know things, you just have things happen to you and are moved to places. She didn't know where she was going and the names of the places.
You do create that experience in this book. I did that impressionistic feel. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I'm done.
I don't want you to be done. I think this was sort of one other. I've got a whole list for you, Paula. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is sort of, World War II fiction. That's a vast category, and historical fiction and war fiction. There are so many books written in this space, and I was curious how you saw your book in that context, and what you see setting your book apart from other World War II novels or other historical novels. And I think you've partially answered that, but if there's sort of more that you were thinking, as this progressed.
No, the only thing I do think that is relevant to say is that I don't see much about this particular Polish experience out there. And I think it happened to an estimated 1 million people or so. And I think, and I've been wondering in my head, only really recently, actually, why it's been so quiet. And I think it must be something to do with the fact that it was subsumed into the communist world. And so therefore it became this, people didn't really talk about what had been done by Russia, because and certainly from a British perspective, it's all about the Nazis and what happened in Western Europe. But actually there was so much suffering in the East too.
I think that's such an interesting point and right point, that it just wasn't the kind of history that then, I guess, blared out to us here in the West. It wasn't the kind of history that we were really sort of getting, because the experience was so different for Poland. And I think
no, and I think it's been portrayed because Poland was made, Poland was failed by Britain and America, frankly, because when at Yalta, it was, given to Stalin. That was the deal they struck. It was a bargaining piece, and it was failed in the beginning because Britain didn't jump in and save them. Britain will always say we entered the war because Poland was invaded, but did nothing until it became imperative and got closer to their shores. So it's interesting. So I think it was obviously something that many Poles who'd been exiled were then settled and had to stay out there because there was a very small window of time when they could join the army and get out. So it's one of those things that's become, I think, probably accepted by many people as just another hardship, really.
Mhm.
And also, and then you get into all the complexities of ethnicities and who was considered a Pole and who was a Lithuanian and who was Jewish and who was Ukraine. And it's such a muddle and a mix up there, really, that, you know, I think these stories sort of have been allowed to be lost a little bit, actually.
Yeah. And again, I think partnered with how much people didn't want to talk about them, or they felt like, you know, these stories didn't need, not that they didn't need to be passed on, but why burden, you know, their children or other generations with these things that they don't want to think about or they don't want to bring forward. I think all of that sort of creates that recipe for these stories being that bit, you know, more lost than they should be.
And also these things are so awful, aren't they? Can you,
Yeah.
you know, I can't imagine how, you know, I'm sure there's that idea that you want to protect your grandchildren, but also how will your grandchildren understand? How will people understand what you've been through? And a long time ago, I made a documentary on the First World War, and it was that same kind of idea. People don't talk about these things because they're truly, truly awful. And they just, that's how you cope with it.
Yeah. Exactly right. Also, what's the name of your documentary, Paula?
Oh, it was called Words of War. It was the 90th commemoration. And actually, we've stitched it together with literally just the words of war. So people's poems and letters. And we told the story through those documents.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the first time. I love these conversations because I get to learn more, more things of yours that I can explore myself. Just this landscape, I think, you know, again, it's so hard to understand all of these sort of shifting, you know, allegiances and the things that were going on that I feel like we've just painted over in broad strokes, especially again, I think from an American or Western perspective. I had something I burningly wanted to ask you, and now I can't remember it. I was so distracted by your answer and being pulled into that story. And I think we're running out of time here. But was there anything that we've talked about before that you wanted to make sure that we shared with everyone here?
No, I don't think so. No, I just think, you know, I always think with fiction that, you know, what you've got that you don't get when you watch telly or whatever, you get inside someone's mind and their experience. And I hope people get that from reading the book. I hope it's that just interior, you get to someone's world and someone's life, and that it's, you know, it's gloomy material, but that the reading brings a connection and a pleasure, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about connecting.
And I feel, you know, that's exactly what I thought. And I'll say, thinking about your book in the historical category, or what sort of spoke to me in this vast space of World War II novels, it was that this felt like the story of a whole life. You know, how it you feel like you see Lena become the woman she is, you know, at every stage of her life. And I felt like that to me was so distinguishing and so much beyond a sort of war story or a historical story. It was a story of a woman's life and how we are formed as human beings. And I feel so grateful to be on that journey. Is it Frida? A Frida sighting? All right. And I think I see Kathy. Kathy, have we hit our time?
We have, and we just want to throw out a few more questions if we might sneak those in. Is that okay? Here we go. Okay, so one question is, in addition to your grandmother, did you have other people who were influences?
Oh, do you mean like literary influences, or in terms
Both.
of stories and backgrounds? We certainly in terms of, there were lots of old Poles around my childhood. So yeah, for example, on the Saturday, you know, when we'd have to go to the Polish school in the morning, then it would be, everyone would repair to the Polish pub or club, and there would be, you know, the old men standing around. And I was born in the 70s, so some of these people were, I remember the men who had, you know, tattoos on their Auschwitz tattoos on their forearms, and it was that kind of thing where everyone had this burden. Anyone who'd arrived in Britain then as a Pole had some war story and some war experiences. So there'd be little snippets of what happened to this person or that person. So I'm sure that all seeped in. It just took a couple of decades to rediscover.
And were there any literary, you mentioned literary influences, were there any?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I would think in terms of influences, I would think more people like I've mentioned before with Helen, like Carol Shields and the Stone Diaries, or like a William Boyd, Any Human Heart. I like the idea of trying to encapsulate a life and what it means and how a person changes in that. So I think that was more of an influence than any particular war story. But then I went to some, like I say, some writings on the Gulag and the camps, just for sort of atmosphere and background and understanding from there.
Great, thank you. And another question is there anything more that you would like to share about your grandmother that you didn't share in the story in the book?
Oh God, where can I start? Well, she was known to be quite a character. I could tell you so many things about this woman. She liked to paint. She used to paint pictures. She used to paint plates for the charity shops, and I was always amazed that the charity shops accepted them to sell on. Maybe she always fed everybody. She was an incredible feeder. Now we, you know, and I didn't really think about where that came from, but really nobody could leave the house. And my old school friend is forever known as Malhefka, which means carrots, because she would only eat carrots. And my grandmother was disgusted by this. She was very scarred by her experience because she hated anything that to her reeked of communism. And so that meant that if I wanted, even sort of, if we discussed the British Labour Party, she'd be trying to thrust money at me not to vote for them. But other than that, she was very stereotypical. She'd wanted to dress in furs. She wanted me dressed in furs. Couldn't understand vegetarianism. Didn't want to live in Britain. Wanted to move to Argentina, whether the weather and the food was better. Yes, she was. Yes, but she had a lot of life and light to her. She was well loved, much loved.
Another topic is more technical about your process of writing. So can you tell us more? How do you write? How did you write this book? Did you write it differently than your other books?
Fundamentally, it's the same. I will set off and try and do a draft. And at the early stages, will make myself do a certain number of words every day just to get something down. And then go back over it. So I will work in a chunk of maybe about 6 to 8 weeks of just really making sure I'm doing it every day, and doing enough. And then I will leave it aside, and then I will come back to it. It's just that process of putting down and coming back, and reading. It's like psychological games you play with yourself, like reading in the way. Sometimes you have to be very kind to yourself and say, it's okay, this is, we can get through this, Paula. And sometimes you have to be very critical, but you have to be careful when you're critical, and then be ready for it. And it's just this endless process, and hoping that it's worthwhile in the end.
A kind of follow-up is, was there a section, a part, a chapter that was the hardest for you to write?
Yes, the ending when they are in the camp in Uzbekistan, that was emotionally the hardest, I think. Some of the early stages of working out her marriage and moving that on were hard in a more technical way. So yes, one was emotional, one was technical.
Very good. Another question just came in. Have you traveled to Poland and Siberia to get a sense of what it was like to be in your grandmother's shoes?
No, I've traveled to Poland a couple of times, but that's been for weddings and to see relatives. But that's been southeastern Poland, which was actually quite near to where my grandmother grew up, but not to Siberia. I'd love to go. I'd very much, yeah, like to see that landscape. So one day.
And I'm not sure if there are other questions. If they pop in, I will ask them. But the last two would be, what are you writing now? What are you reading now that you can talk to us about?
Oh, I'm actually getting very cross about inequality. So I'm writing at the moment something that is about teenagers in a very unequal world that's meant to be a utopia but isn't, but I'm not sure where that's going, so I'm sort of being quite careful and cagey about that. But yes,
I'm like perking up over here. But I'll receive.
I just have to, yeah, it's, yes, I understand now what I need, and what I need is to write something that really feels important to me, to make it feel I'm not wasting my time. So that's what's obsessing me at the moment. So we'll see where that goes. And what was the other question?
And is there anything you can share with us about what you are reading now?
Oh, I've actually just started reading Gilead and Marilyn Robinson. Just because it's around, you love it. I'm looking at
one of my all-time favorite books. I reread it every few years. What a beautiful, beautiful book.
Yeah. I'm really in she's just a master at being inside her head and narrative, and yet revealing a whole world. So I'm loving that. I just read recently Small Things Like These. I've been reading short fiction because I've been moving house, so it's dusty and chaos. But I also read, but it's interesting when you think about what fiction do I like and what would I recommend? And I think, well, I love these books that convey truths and have much clarity to them and involve you in the narrative and inside the head. And yet at the same time, I just read a really good, quite gothic book about the witch trials in Britain called The Manningtree Witches. And that is very sort of flamboyant and ornate language, but in the same way gets you inside someone's story and relationship. So it just, good writing is good writing, I think.
Absolutely. And we have had the pleasure. I'm sure those who are listening are ready to read your book. So with that, we will thank you both. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Paula. Wonderful conversation tonight. For the listeners, please consider purchasing your copy of The Snow Hare from R.J. Julia, Wesley and R.J. Julia, and Bookhampton. The links are in the chat box. And thank you so much, everyone. Helen, Paula, everyone who has joined us from R.J. Julia, Wesley and R.J. Julia, Bookhampton. Thank you and good night.